All right. So some voids and things we need to know around all this. The Fed has this phrase they use called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a nice term for saying that they're increasing the money supply. Okay? You don't want to go around saying, we're increasing the money supply, because there's lots of bad connotations. Remember the quantity theory of money? There are implications for the Fed to go around and increase the money supply all the time. So we don't increase the money supply. We practice quantitative easing. It sounds cooler. It sounds like it's some, something your doctor would tell you they're going to do. It won't hurt a bit. Okay? So quantitative easing. And again, traditionally they do this by buying U.S. bonds, by buying up the national debt. They buy U.S. federal government bonds. And that's traditionally how they've always done that. Since the 2008, 9, 10 recession, and even through now, the Fed is willing to buy other kinds of securities. So they buy a lot of mortgage-backed securities, or they buy other kinds of bonds that they hadn't done this in the past, but now they're willing to extend what they're willing to buy and buy a lot of stuff that, it's riskier and it's a different approach to the problem. But remember, back from our last chapter, that banks created all these really risky assets, right? And people were defaulting on their mortgages and defaulting on their home loans. And if you take the good stuff, if the Fed buys up all the good stuff and leaves the bank with the bad stuff, that's really not making sure the financial system is sound, right? Because now the banks are holding on to this bad loans and bad bonds and bad stuff. So the Fed, part of its goal is to create stability, right? One way it can do that is buy a bunch of these mortgage-backed securities or other things away from the banks, and that helps make the financial system more secure. So in their minds, they're not doing that solely because they want to expand the money supply. In part, they're doing that to get those assets off of the balance sheets of the banks, and they put it on the Fed's balance sheet. Okay? So speaking of the devil, the Fed's balance sheet. The Fed's balance sheet has grown dramatically. The Fed's balance sheet used to always be like $600 billion, and now it's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Okay, it's much bigger than it ever was before. And the reason is, of course, that they bought this quantitative easing. To do the quantitative easing, they not only bought a bunch of treasury bonds, but they bought these mortgage-backed securities, and that dramatically increased the assets in their balance sheet. But it also, on the other side, increases their liabilities, because their liabilities are the amount of money that's out in the system, and that's grown a lot, right? It's the amount of money in the system is trillions of dollars higher than it was 10 years ago. And these reserves, which are also trillions of dollars higher. So the Fed is holding these reserves, and the amount of reserves they've got is several trillion dollars higher than it used to be. The amount of money they've got is several trillion dollars higher than it used to be. Those are their liabilities. Those are balanced against trillions of dollars of bonds that they've bought that are on the asset side. They were starting to clean this up. They were starting to get rid of stuff that was on their balance sheet and shrink their balance sheet down. And then, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, but then President Trump yelled at them, and they stopped cleaning up their balance sheet. Okay? And that's not really supposed to happen, but yeah. All right? The Fed, and again, we'll talk about this more, but it's important when you think about this. The Fed did not reload its gun. When the financial crisis hit in 2008-9, the Fed shot all its bullets. It was out of bullets. It was bulletless. It had bulleted. And it was starting to reload its gun, but it waited until, 2017 kind of to start reloading its gun. And then in 2018 and 2019, it started shooting those bullets again as if we were in a recession, which we weren't. And then when the crisis hits in 2020, they don't have a lot of bullets to fire at the Fed anymore because they didn't reload their gun, right? And sorry if you don't like the gun analogy, but it's the best analogy I have for that. Okay? So this is the interest rate on excess reserves. It only goes back, here because that's when it started, right? And then it was look at this, right? So you keep it low to help out during the recession, but then maybe you should have started making it go up here, right? And you could have made it go up slow. But we get to 2017 and then we really start pushing it up. And then 2018, the president goes, oh, get those interest rates down. And then it's starting to come back down. And then the crisis hits early 2020 and it basically goes way down. And again, why do we raise it? We raise it to make the Fed funds rate go up. And why do we lower it? We lower it to make the federal funds rate go down. When that Fed funds rate goes down to zero, that makes it easy for banks, or near zero, that makes it easy for banks to lend and borrow to each other. Okay? Adds liquidity to the system. All right. So there's something in this whole mess called a liquidity trap. And yeah, it's associated with the Keynesians, with the followers of Keynes, but Keynes never said anything like this. However, in the modern world, we don't call it the liquidity trap. We call it the zero lower bound problem. Okay, in the old days, liquidity trap. Now, the zero lower bound problem. There's only so much you can lower interest rates. And once interest rates get really low, how much effect does lowering them have? Right? So if the Fed funds rate is 1% and you lower it to 0.75%, who cares? If it's 5% and you lower it to 3%, all right, I can make some money off of that. But if it's 1%, if it's 0.75% and you lower it to 0.5%, okay, it's nice of you, but there's really not a lot of money-making opportunities in that, right? So when interest rates get really low, they hit this zero lower bound problem, or this liquidity trap problem, where lowering them doesn't have much effect on things, right? Again, if the Fed funds rate in the mid-2000s is up around 5%, they quickly move it down as the recessions come in to more like 2%, and then even below that down to zero eventually. When you first start making those moves, banks are like, 3%, so much better than 5%. But when it's 1.25% and you lower it to 1%, the banks are like, okay. But really, there's no advantage. There's hardly any advantage to them in that. So as the interest rates approach zero, they stop being effective in changing economic activity. And the Keynesians would call it a liquidity trap. In modern terms, we talk about this zero lower bound problem. In Europe, they have actively turned interest rates negative in many countries to try to get more oomph into the financial system. We haven't done that intentionally in the United States. It's happened a couple times unintentionally, but we haven't done it intentionally the way the Europeans have. Okay? This is a big point of discussion among economists, is the zero lower bound problem and what it means, and should interest rates go negative? President Trump has suggested that we should have negative interest rates in the United States. If you're a bank, okay, you want people to pay you money if you give them a loan, right? If I'm a normal person, and I have a couple $1,000s in savings, I want the bank to pay me some money on that. If you're just a normal person and you can, you're saving $20 a week or $100, you're just putting a little bit of money away every now and then. When interest rates are this low, when interest rates are zero or negative, there's no way for you to make money on your savings, right? The lower part of the income distribution who doesn't have enough money to get into the stock market or to other things, they don't get any return on their savings. But as interest rates go down to zero or negative, then Wall Street gets all this free money and they can go out and make a ton of money off of that. So there's a underlying question here, right? The Bernie folks maybe against the Wall Street folks, or the Elizabeth Warren folks against the Wall Street folks. Where does Main Street put its money that makes sense when interest rates are zero or negative? Wall Street's really happy with free money, right? Main Street maybe not so much. It's a question. All right. So a lot of this falls under this term macroprudential policy. The point of macroprudential policy is that instead of the Fed being reactive and the Fed saying, oh, the economy is turning this down, we need to do something, the idea is to try to protect things from turning bad in the first place. Prudential, macroprudential. All right? And I put two people up here, Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. They used to, both of them, first Ben Bernanke and then Janet Yellen, were the chairs of the Federal Reserve. So Ben Bernanke, chair of the Federal Reserve, parts of the 2000s into the early parts of the, so a few years before the financial crisis, all through the financial crisis, then a few years after the financial crisis, and then Janet Yellen takes over for the Fed for a while, and then when Donald Trump becomes president, he fires her and puts in Jay Powell. So macroprudential policy includes things like stress tests on banks and this liquidity coverage ratio. So how do we make sure that banks have enough reserves? The answer is there's this liquidity coverage ratio plan, which is part of the Fed. I'm not going to tell you everything about it, and we'll talk about it more in a second. The rule itself, the document that tells a bank what to do, is something like 103 pages long. And then there's little addendums to it. So it's very complex. It's more complex than we need to understand. Okay? But the idea is that it's tailored to each individual bank. If you're a really small bank, if you're like a bank in Holyoke, Colorado, and you've got a few $1 million in assets in your bank, this doesn't apply to you at all. Okay? You don't have to worry about this. You have got to figure out how to run your bank in a safe manner, and the Fed's still going to look at your bank and make sure it's okay. But this is primarily intended to make sure that the big banks that most of us bank with, the big banks, are able to, again, deal with 30 days or more of a financial problem from their own resources. So depending on how that bank has structured its portfolio, that will determine the assets that it has to keep, the liquidity that it has to keep, and that system is called this liquidity coverage ratio. Big banks also have to go through, as part of this, these stress tests. So instead of waiting for a crisis to see if Lehman Brothers can survive it, which it can't, we run simulated financial crises on top of these banks and see if the bank can survive this simulated crisis. Okay? We don't stick airline pilots in an airplane and then wait till a crisis happens and see if they crash or not. We put them into flight trainers, right, simulators, and they throw things at them. And if you want to be an airline pilot, you have to land your plane. But you get to land your plane in the simulator first, so that they know if that crisis happens to you in real life, you ain't going to crash the plane. Okay? Same thing with the banks. We put the banks in a simulator, make sure they're not going to crash. Okay? It's called stress tests. Only applies again to the big banks. These two are just big fans of this macroprudential policy. They're the one that took the Fed this way. They're the ones that really believed in the stress tests and the other macroprudential policy. Jay Powell does not seem to be as big a fan of it, but the switch away from fractional reserve banking to this liquidity coverage ratio thing happens under his watch. So it's not that he's against it, but the three of them gave a panel discussion at a convention, and I know you're very excited about the idea of someday going to a convention full of economists. But it was clear at that discussion that Bernanke and Yellen are much bigger fans of macroprudential things, trying to prevent problems from happening first rather than reacting to them. They're much more a believer that the Fed can create rules that will prevent these problems ahead of time. And Jay Powell is a little more skeptical that the Fed can just come up with rules and operating procedures for banks that will prevent these crises from happening. Anyway.